times require unusual actions. This is Rick Levine with a few words before the August forecast begins. Sometimes reality mirrors the planetary symbolism in ways that are so accurate, all we can do is laugh. The August forecast was recorded with Mercury the Trickster, stationary retrograde, and also just prior to the Aquarius lunar eclipse. Venus was opposing Neptune, and the Sun was squaring Uranus. So what does an astrologer do? I checked and rechecked my recording equipment because I didn't want the unstable planetary energy to get the best of me. I checked batteries, microphone, cameras, lighting, and more. I was all ready to go. Unfortunately, Mischievous Mercury had his way anyhow. The sound and lights and recording are all fine. However, someone must have inadvertently bumped into the camera on the tripod, and I am mostly outside of the frame of the video. There are excellent shots of my elbow, shoulder, and hand, and a few even include parts of my face, and occasionally my whole face makes a cameo appearance. But since this is recorded in front of a live audience, I decided to honor retrograde Mercury and release the video in this format. It's all I could do. Needless to say, you can hear my voice clearly, and the information stands on its own. The good news is that there are no longer advertisements on my YouTube videos because of the support I've received through Patreon. Even better, next month I will have a videographer running the camera to prevent this from happening again. Sometimes reality mirrors the planetary symbolism so well, all we can do is laugh. Welcome to the last Wednesday night of July for Astrology Night here at Soul Food Coffee House in Redmond, Washington. And we have a lovely group of people here this evening on a very warm Seattle summer evening. I kind of expected that people would be going to the pool or to the beach or whatever, and that there would be 3 people here, so it's nice to see a nice group of people. And greetings to all of you folks out there in internet land. As I've mentioned before, we're pushing between 50 and 75,000 viewers a month out there in cyberspace, wherever that out there is. I don't understand spatial references anymore. I used to. But we're here tonight to talk about the astrology of the upcoming month of August. And as always, we'll get to that in just a moment. I'll try to keep my prologue short this evening. Just a couple of quick mentions. Number one, there is still space for the Think Cosmically, Act Locally experience in Bali. This will be my 7th Bali retreat, and this is from October 6th through the 15th this year, 2018. It's held at a retreat center about 20 minutes outside of Ubud, Bali. Ubud is the cultural capital of Bali. The retreat center was built by a very dear friend of mine. It's a very magical place. And if anyone is interested, there are still a few spaces available. This is a small group, intense, experientially oriented experience sounds redundantly redundant, but there are cards over there that will give you more information, and if anyone is even remotely interested, contact me directly or grab me after the meeting, or if you're out there in internet, send me an email, because there won't be many spaces left, and if you're interested, we want to make sure that you get to go. Otherwise, it will be a couple of years before my next Bali venture, I am sure. One down, one to go. Well, 1.5 to go. I'm heading off to Brighton Bush this weekend. You're either registered or you're not. A number of you here have been to previous Brighton Bush workshops, and I will be off the grid completely for an entire week. Yay! And so if you've registered, we'll see you there, and if not, we'll see you on the far side. That was the half. The other piece is I just want to very quickly bring you up to date on my Patreon ventures. Mostly, I want to say thank you to all of you folks out there who have jumped in and caught me. As you may know, I jumped out of a 100-story building. That is, I walked away from a 17-year job of writing daily horoscopes, and I jumped. And I've been thinking about it for a while, and Patreon, that's Patreon, like patron with an E, patreon.com is an internet platform that supports creatives, and I don't want to go too far into it right here. If you're interested in even pursuing this at all, go to patreon.com/Rick Levine, and there's a number of levels of participation that you out there in internet land or you here in soul food land can support these monthly talks, which, as you guys know, have been going on for 10 years now. For as little as $1 a month, you can become a supporter, and for $10 a month, you can get weekly astrology teachings or a mid-month update or participate in a monthly class on chart interpretation. I'm not going to say more about it. If you're interested, go to Patreon, check it out. But thank you all to those of you who have already jumped in to support me, and this is going to work. So away we go with that. That being said, we are here on the cusp, which is just Latin for edge, of August of 2018, and that's what we have to talk about. And you know, every month when I do these, I try to come up with some theme in advance so there's some cohesiveness to my sometimes lack of cohesiveness as I look at things in the world in general. This is retrograde deja vu. It is intense retrograde period. And I was talking with my editor this afternoon, and she suggested, you know, all this retrograde, I was playing around with, you know, retrograde all over again, or deja Mercury, or I don't know, something of that sort. And she said what it really is Mercury Madness. And that's what's going on right now. It is Mercury Madness. And there is some madness out there, and madness in the sense of craziness, and madness in the sense of misplaced anger, mad, angry. And I know I talked about some of this last month, but when I say last month, I mean looking at July's, understanding that this is being recorded on July 25th. And so we still have a few days left in July, and I don't want to spend too much time talking about these last few days of July, but it's going to be difficult to get around the fact that we have a full moon eclipse occurring in a couple of days, and Mercury is turning retrograde tomorrow night. That would be late on the night of the 26th or early on the 27th, depending upon where you are on the planet. And so this is such an incredible swirl of energies, and a lot of the energies are 90 degrees to one another. And again, I talked about this quite a bit last month. And for those of you who are at the $3 a month level, at the mid-month update that I sent out, I talked about this quite a bit more because it's such an extraordinary, pivotal point. And this point is that retrogrades are not just about going back into the past. Although although that's what we often think about them. You know, there are, and I hear stories all the time, and this happens in my life, the phone ring, and the rings, for those of you who still have a phone, the phone rings, or Skype, you know, makes whatever that horrific noise is that it makes, and it's someone that you haven't talked to in 5 years. Or it's an old friend, or an old love, or something of that sort. There's a lot of that returning to the past when planets go retrograde. However, it's more than that, because it's also a bit of a time loop. And I know I talked about this some last month, but I do want to talk about it a bit more, because now we're in it another step. Last month, Mars was retrograde, turned retrograde. Mars stays retrograde all through August, actually through the very end of August. Mars turns direct on August 27th. I'm just getting some dates down here for you so that then we can drill down a bit deeper into this whole retrograde swirl. So Mars turned retrograde on June 26th. And it turns direct on August 27th. Mars is such a weird planet when it comes to how it moves, because it races through 10 or 11 signs in about a year and a quarter, and then it spends about 7 months right around, hovering around one sign. And that's because when Earth and Mars are on the same side of the sun, they kind of travel at similar speeds, so Mars slows down, or it looks like it does. As Earth passes it, it looks like it's going backwards, but then it kind of speeds up again. So I talked last month quite a bit about how during the Mars retrograde phase, it's like pulling back on a bow. In order to release the arrow, you have to pull back and get the tension. That's part of what's feeding all of July and pretty much all of August, because even though Mars turns direct on August 27th, it'll still take a few days or a week or two before it actually picks up enough speed to really go forward, because the planets don't just boom shift, they change speed gradually, and they change speed only visually from Earth's point of view. They don't really go backwards. Okay. So we have Mars in this 10-week or 9-week, 9.5-week retrograde period that we're well into. We're halfway into it. We can already feel, and I talked about this last month a bit too, that when a planet goes retrograde, it gets closer to Earth. When it gets closer to Earth, it's like the radio signal gets louder. What's Mars's signal? It's about redness, it's about anger, it's about assertion, it's about talking tough, it's about taking control of the moment to define one's boundaries or to penetrate into someone else's boundaries. Doesn't have to necessarily be sexual for all of you who just went there. But of course Jupiter is in Scorpio, and so there we go. Okay. So when a planet is retrograde, it intensifies that energy of that planet. And we've certainly seen that on the political scene, where there's all, I mean, look, we have a president with Mars rising in his birth chart, Mars on his ascendant in Leo, and so there's this whole anger that's up front, always. But now that Mars is retrograde, there's this hostility that feels like we're on the precipice once again, maybe always, but I mean, at least always recently. But that's part of what's been going on through July, and that will continue all through August. Now, into that, and I don't know how I got this far into this discussion this evening, because even though I've been talking about the retrogrades, and before we started recording, I mentioned something about today's Sun square Uranus, which is also unexpected. It's electric. There's suddenness. There's a release of tension, if you will, whenever a planet aspects Uranus, especially angry Mars by a 90-degree angle. This would be a good time to misplace anger and threaten war on some country that isn't an enemy. Go figure. All right, so The other thing that I didn't mention is that we are in the middle of 3 eclipses. Eclipses normally come in pairs, but occasionally they come in threes. And we had an eclipse 2 weeks ago. We have one the day after tomorrow, today on the 27th, a full moon eclipse. It will not be visible here in the United States because it'll occur, I think it's at 1:42 p.m. Here in Seattle, which means that it's daylight, and in a full moon eclipse, the moon becomes eclipsed, and so it's kind of hard to see a full moon during daylight hours because a full moon only appears at night wherever you are. All right, so, but there's still this full moon eclipse occurring, and then we have the 3rd eclipse, which many astrologers are saying is the real McCoy of these 3, and that's the one on August 11th, and we will get there. But there's this whole feeling of edginess, of nerves on edge, of uncertainty, of frustration, because here we were with Mars going along so well, and then all of a sudden it stops and it goes into reverse, and it's like we're still going forward in our mind, but all of a sudden everything isn't moving as fast as it's supposed to be, and we get frustrated and we get angry, and typically we punch the wrong thing. I'm not saying punching is ever right, but typically what happens is that our anger becomes unexpressed because it feels inappropriate, and if it's inappropriate and unexpressed, then it becomes projected, and we take it out on someone we feel safe with rather than an appropriate target where the energy actually really needs to go. So halfway into this Mars retrograde period, we have Mercury, which turns retrograde on, where'd it go? There it is, on Mercury, which turns retrograde on July 25th or 26th, depending upon where you are. That's either late tonight or early tomorrow morning. So we are at the point where Mercury, even though it's not retrograde yet, it ain't moving nowhere. Double negative noted. In other words, in order for a planet to change directions, it's like a pendulum going back and forth. And it has to slow down, stop, and then pick up speed gradually, and it moves fastest halfway through the cycle. Which means that because we're halfway through the Mars retrograde cycle, it means that Mars is moving retrograde right now faster than it's going to be moving retrograde at any other part of the cycle. In fact, Mars reaches its halfway point in the cycle this weekend on July 29th, when Mars actually is opposed to the Sun and reaches its closest point to Earth as it gets in this cycle, while Mars is also at its closest point to the Sun that it gets, which means that the Mars is brighter in the sky right now. After the Sun goes down and you look up in the sky, aside from Venus close to the horizon, the brightest thing that you'll see up overhead is Mars, and it's red, and it's big red. However, for those of you who have received emails saying that it'll be as big as the moon, don't go there. Every few years that email resurfaces, and it's like one of those things. All right, so into this Mars retrograde phase, while Mars is now moving retrograde as fast as it can go, as fast as it will go retrograde, Mercury stops in its tracks and begins its retrograde dance. So what does this mean? It means that the energies are amped up. It means that not only is the anger radio station, the assertion radio station, Mars, coming in louder than normal, so is the communication station, Mercury. Now remember, Mercury gets a bad rap, and I know I'm probably repetitive here because every 3 months when Mercury turns retrograde, I tell the same story. And that story is that astrologically, historically, we are told that Mercury retrograde sucks. don't sign contracts, don't buy computers, don't buy a car, don't travel, don't breathe, don't eat, because whatever you do when Mercury is retrograde surely will screw up and be a total mess. Well, I don't know if anyone here has ever traveled, but chances are you traveled when Mercury was not retrograde and still had a miserable experience somewhere along the line. I can speak personally that in my life, I've had some of the most amazing, smoothest long-distance travel experiences. I bought the best computer I ever had in my 35, 40 years of buying computer experience. I bought under a Mercury retrograde. The problem is that when Mercury is retrograde, because the energy is all amped up, we think we need to do something really quickly. And so someone comes along and goes, hey, I got this great computer. Well, I'm looking for a computer. Well, it's right here. Here, I'll sell it to you for blah, blah, blah. Okay, I'll buy it. And then you take it home and you realize that it's a Mac and you only have PC software or whatever. This because you don't think it through. You go out looking for a car on the day that Mercury turns retrograde, and the first car you see is a purple Porsche, and the guy says, you know what, this is such a unique car, whatever, it's normally $70,000, I'll give it to you for $20,000 because you're, all right, I'll take it. Oh my God, and you drive home and you realize, what the hell am I going to do with my wife and 2 kids? You know, it's like this only has 2 seats. So we do make stupid decisions when Mercury is retrograde, but it's not because Mercury is retrograde. It's not that Mercury retrograde makes us make bad decisions. It's that the intensity of the thought process and of the communication stuff makes us feel like if we don't do it right now, we won't get a chance to do it. We'll like miss the opportunity. And so when Mercury is retrograde, the most important thing you can do is to take a few deep breaths and chill. So the entire month of August is a study in retrograde, even though Mercury turns direct on the 18th, and even though Mars turns direct on the 27th, they're not going to be moving fast enough to really get us out of the mess, because they're going to still be covering the territory that they went through when they turned retrograde. So we're still caught in this time loop of yesteryear, this year, next year, and it's kind of like all mixed up. Mercury retrogrades are the most noticeable because Mercury moves faster than any other planet. It moves so fast compared to the other planets that when it turns retrograde, it's almost like being in a car screeching to a halt and then slamming into reverse. You know that something changed direction. If you're in a Mack truck going 1/4 mile an hour and you put it into reverse, you'll barely know the difference because you're moving so slow. More momentum, but you're moving so slowly. So we notice the Mercury retrogrades. But here's the other thing about Mercury and Mercury retrograde. You know, we think of Mercury as the communication planet, and it is. We think of Mercury as the interactive, anything interactive. The word mercantile, which means trading of goods. I'll give you something, you give me something. That's Mercury. The word mercantile comes from Mercury. But Mercury is also mischievous. Mercury is the trickster. You know what Mercury did on the day he was born? Does anyone know this story? On the day Mercury was born, he climbed out of his crib and went and stole some sheep. And then got back, and I may have this story a little wrong, but he went out, he did some bad shit, he came back, and then he lied about it and said, no, it wasn't me. Mercury is the trickster. Mercury is the trickster planet. So, we have this environment where Mars is going retrograde, we're in the middle of eclipses, and Mercury is turning retrograde. We also have this other pattern that I've talked about for a few months. I'll mention a little bit more about it a little later, and that is the trine between Jupiter and Neptune. Jupiter and Neptune, expansive, imaginary, illusionary. This is not a negative energy because trines express energy, but what's negative for one person may not be negative for another. And here's what's happening out there in the real world. Many of you know or saw the live interaction, the press conference that occurred with Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin in Helsinki. There was a question that was asked during that press conference. And I think it was someone from the Wall Street Journal. Everyone out there in internet land will correct me if I'm wrong, and I may be who said it. But the question was something like, directed to Putin, did you want Trump to win, and did you tell anyone to do anything about it? And Putin answered, and this was a live feed, and Putin answered, yes, I did. And yes, I did. Well, yesterday, the White House released the tape of that press conference, and magically the first half of that question is edited out. So, and they were talking prior to that something about Syria. They were talking about something completely different. So the question was, did you do anything about it? And Putin said, yes, I did. To make matters worse, on Russian national television, that same press conference was also released to the public in Russia, and that entire question-answer thing was just gone. Mercury, the trickster. We have now a situation where our liar-in-chief is basically gone on record telling the American people, do not believe what you hear, do not believe what you read, do not believe your senses, believe what I tell you. This is Mercury. This is the shadow side, and I don't mean Mercury going into its shadow. This is the dark side of Mercury as the trickster, especially when being supported by Mars retrograde, eclipses, and this Jupiter, big thinking, expansive, positive optimism in trine with illusory, deceptive, confusing Neptune. Are you with me here? Okay. Can we move on now? Welcome to, I was going to say welcome to the real world, but it doesn't work, does it? It doesn't work. I remember many years ago, back in my college days, I had a buddy named Sandy Pearlman, who was the lyricist and manager for a group that became the Blue Oyster Cult. And his lyrics were amazing, but he had this saying that he would appear in his writing that was, how was it? It was imaginary but real. You know, and people forget that in the Freudian sense, something that is imaginary does not mean that it's unreal. It just means that it's a product of wish fulfillment. Because if you imagine something, you can manifest it, and it's real. So this whole idea of the line between imaginary and reality, fantasy and reality, dreams and reality is a bit shady. And I remember, and I've quoted this before, Rob Hand, who I referred to as the academic dean of astrology, who's the guy who wrote the modern classics, and most astrologers look up to Rob and his work. And Rob wrote many years ago, it used to be that Saturn was reality and Neptune was illusion, whereas now it appears that Neptune might be reality and Saturn the illusion that there is one. Interesting thing, huh? You see, because before the outer planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto were discovered, Saturn was the limit. Seeing was believing. What you perceived was real, and if you didn't perceive it, it wasn't real. But that's not the way it is anymore. All right, so let's look at some chart now. And I can see the comments on my YouTube page already. He didn't start talking about the month until 23 minutes into it. We've been talking about the month. Chill out there. All right. Okay, so we're going to start off and take a quick look at the chart for the full moon eclipse. We have the sun in Leo, and we have Mars and the moon lined up, and that Mars is retrograde, so we got that whole anger issue. And we also have here all of those planets, Mars, retrograde, the moon, and the sun, all squaring Uranus. And this is a chart that is rife with the potential of anything can happen. So it's real important for us individually to make sure that we work with our own anger rather than just lashing out with it unconsciously. On August 1st, retrograde Mars, let me do this. Okay, there we go. On August 1st, retrograde Mars backs into a square to Uranus. And I talked about this extensively last month. I don't want to belabor it now, but the fact of the matter is that Mars moved into that square with Uranus. It retrograded back through that square as it is now, and it will move direct through it in September. And this is a bit about that whole uncertainty. Mars, again, is aggression, physicality, it's assertion, it's taking care of business. Mars can be very effective because it is basically taking control of the moment and doing what needs to be done. Mars competently, used is what a surgeon uses Mars when they're doing the precision work that they do, or even again someone protecting you or you protecting someone you love. That's a functional Mars. But Mars, when it squares Uranus, there's that Uranus. You've heard me say this before. Uranus's only job is the resolution of irresolvable opposites. Well, how can that be? If two things can't be resolved, how do they get resolved? Because that's Uranus's job. And all I can say is use the example of lightning during a thunderstorm. It's like the energy is becoming more and more tense. The electrical charge is building up and building up until all of a sudden, and don't jump out of your seats, you jumped out of your seat. I warned you. But you see, this is exactly how Uranus works. You can know it's coming, you can hear the warning, but you don't know when the lightning is going to strike or where it's going to strike. And that's how Uranus works. And so Uranus becomes the astrologer's downfall because it's the planet of unpredictability. Well, that's easy. I can just tell you on such and such a day, well, actually, between now and August 1st, stuff is going to happen that can't be predicted. How can I be wrong? But when you look retrospectively out of it, you'll go, oh my God, who could have predicted that? And this whole thing, this fiasco that happened, in Helsinki, and then Trump inviting Putin to the White House, and today McConnell and Paul Ryan talked the president out of it, so it's Mercury retrograde. Now, apparently Putin is not invited to the White House until 2019, but mark my words, because this was done on a Mercury stationary retrograde, that date will change 3 times yet, or at least once more. All right, so the beginning of August is total instability. We have the sun in Leo, moving toward a square with Jupiter, and it reaches that square by August 6th, because the sun moves at about a degree a day, and there you can see on August 6th, we're looking at just the connection here. We're looking at just the connection between Jupiter and the sun, that being a 90-degree angle. And unlike the connection between, on August 1st, between Jupiter and, between the sun and Uranus, the sun and Uranus is unpredictable, but the sun and Jupiter is predictable. What's the prediction? This is around August 6th. Too much, over-amping, overindulgence, making something sound better than it really is. So that's a big square, and it's problematic because the sun and Jupiter are the two largest things in our little local solar system, in our little local world. On top of that, on that day, Uranus turns retrograde. Actually, it turns retrograde on the 7th, but it's right in there, and this Uranus retrograde is part of this whole pivot that I'm trying to make the point of what's happening here with what I'm calling Mercury Madness, because we don't know what's going on. We can't figure out what's going on. Seeing is not believing. Hearing is not necessarily what you hear. And into this Mercury turning direct and then Uranus turning retrograde, it's all of the breakthroughs that we thought we made are all of a sudden back, and they're being undone, if you will. On August 7th, also, we get a little bit of reprieve from Venus just moving into Libra, forming a trine with Mars retrograding. Remember, Mars was in Capricorn. Mars likes being in Capricorn. And Mars in Capricorn, Mars was in Capricorn, moved into Aquarius mid-May, then turned retrograde the end of June. And as it turned retrograde, it was in Aquarius, but in mid-August, on August 12th, Mars backs into Capricorn, where it's a whole lot more functional, and it stays in Capricorn all the way through mid-September, because remember, because Mars turns direct the end of the month. So we have this return of almost like a remedial course in using that Mars functionally to get things done for real, rather than Mars in Aquarius, which is more uncontrollable and sudden and unexpected. Aquarius has a flavor of Uranus to it, whereas there's that unpredictability tied to it. So as we move forward, we have Uranus now turning direct. We have, by August 8th, Mercury retrograde. Can we get back here? There we go. By August 8th, Mercury retrograde, that would be right here. Mercury retrograde backs over the sun. Can you see that, how it switches places? Because Mercury retrograde comes between the Earth and the sun, and all of a sudden it's behind the sun. As I say behind the sun, I mean longitudinally. It's and so this is almost like Mercury moving its fastest during its retrograde on August 8th, August 9th. By August 9th, we have another little problem that surfaces, and that's Venus, that moved into Libra, is now squaring Saturn. So we have Venus moving into a square with Saturn. That's a square. That's 90 degrees. But at the same time, Saturn is harmonizing within a degree. It's harmonizing to Uranus. That's 120 degrees. That's a trine. Which means that Venus is 150 degrees, or a quincunx to Uranus. Now, let me break that down. So what you can see here now is that Venus, Saturn, and Uranus are kind of like in this triangle with a blue line, a green line, and a red line. Well, this pattern is very powerful because what it's saying is Venus is square Saturn. Venus and Saturn are hard. They don't get along with each other very well usually, but when they're square, it's even worse. Why don't they get along? Well, Venus is loving and romantic and sweet and sugary and making things nice. Yum, yum, Venus, yum. Sounds like run, Dick, run, or, yum, Venus, yum. And Venus square Saturn, Saturn is saying, no, can't, don't, not worth it, boundaries. And Venus is saying, but I want, and Saturn is saying, tough, can't have. And so Venus and Saturn, when they're square, feels isolating. If someone has Venus square Saturn in their chart natally, it's not a sign of gloom and doom, but it typically means you need to work harder for the same love that someone else just gets being lazy. And someone who has a Venus conjunct or square Saturn, might overcompensate even. Two people come to mind very quickly, in fact, with a Venus-Saturn conjunction. One of them is Donald Trump. Venus-Saturn, I'm not loved enough, therefore I'll do anything to get love. I feel like I'm not worth enough. Venus, value, money, worth, therefore I'll accumulate a lot to feel better, but I never feel better because I don't feel like I have enough. So Trump is one person with a Venus-Saturn conjunction. Another person who wears it very differently is Bill Gates, but the outcome is very similar, interestingly enough. And that is that feeling like I need to live my life and accumulate a lot. Now, whether or not you like what Bill Gates is doing with his money these days, I think he's well-intended. Whether or not it's useful, well, I don't know how to go there. The fact of the matter is that there's a world of difference between these two guys, but they both have a very strong Venus-Saturn. And so when Venus is square Saturn, we may feel isolated even in the best of circumstances. We may feel like, you know what? It isn't worth communicating, or relationships aren't worth it. It's just, I'll just feel alone. I'll just go home and be lonely, But Saturn is harmonizing with Uranus, and that in a way is giving us some stability to move to new ground, to move somewhere new. And then the third piece of that is that Venus over these couple of days through the 7th, 8th, 9th is quincunx, which is that irritation aspect. Before we started the camera rolling, we were making an adjustment, and I said, too loud, too soft, too loud, too soft. That's a quincunx. Because with quincunxes, you can't get it right. They're irritating. It's a Virgo in energy, and perfection is elusive. And so with Venus quincunx Uranus, it becomes, I want and need my freedom, but I want and need my goodies from being close to someone. And it's almost impossible to find that balance. So that moves us through August 9th, when we also have we also have Mercury, which is retrograding now back into that square with Jupiter. Remember, the Sun squared Jupiter just a couple days ago, and so now we're talking shit that's big. We're basically covering our butt and we're saying things, it'll be okay. You watch the news, there'll be some sort of, a couple of days where some spin will be everything is fine, everything will be perfect, because when Jupiter squares, when Mercury squares Jupiter, sometimes there are just too many damn planets running around in my head. When Mercury squares Jupiter, we can overstate the truth to the point where it's no longer true. We can make something sound so good, and if during those days someone comes to you with an opportunity and it all sounds too good to be true, it's too good to be true. Got it? Okay, so let's move on. We have a couple of other things to cover and get us to the end of the month. We're getting dangerously close to the eclipse on August 11th, which is where we need to jump to next. And okay, that's close enough. The actual eclipse on August 11th occurs at 2:57 a.m., and that's Pacific Daylight Time. We can move this. And this eclipse occurs at 18 degrees of Leo. And the important thing about this eclipse is that it's not necessarily grounded with a lot of other things in the chart. There is a square between the eclipse, including that Mercury retrograde to Jupiter. So there's this energy of too much, of like enough, too much. It's the Mae West line, I think she once said, too much of a good thing is a good thing, but it may not be. Or here, it definitely isn't. But the other thing about this particular quincunx is that, the other thing about this particular conjunction is that this new moon eclipse in Leo, eclipses always take the current moment and they blank it out and make us either remember something from the past or integrate something from the future. I like to think of eclipses as someone playing with the light switch of reality. You know, reality normally, we see it as a constant analog thing out there, but the universe is blinking on and off at several hundred trillion times a second. I mean, that's what it does, always. We don't see that. But it's almost like during an eclipse, instead of the universe blinking on and off at several hundred trillion times a second, all of a sudden it's just blinking on and off, like blink, 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 blink. And it's almost, you know, like a certain frequency can induce an epileptic, or it can induce a seizure. That's kind of what happens in eclipses. It's like this polarization kind of induces an altered state. And often there's like a cutoff of some sort. With solar eclipses, the old wisdom was the evil king must die. Now, for those of you who remember me talking about the Great American Eclipse last August and projecting that onto our illustrious king, obviously he's still here.
But he's dead inside.
Yeah, it's like, never mind. I don't have to restrain myself, I do restrain myself. However, this eclipse again brings up a whole lot of issues around our political situation because A, it is in Leo, and Trump does have Leo rising and his Mars is in Leo. And also, this eclipse has some other connections with Trump's chart. I don't have his chart up right now here, but the fact is, and I think the most important thing about this eclipse is that the eclipse is actually quincunx to Pluto. You see that? The eclipse is at 18 degrees, meaning that within an hour after the eclipse, the moon will move to 19 degrees and then 19 and a half degrees and make that exact quincunx with Pluto. And within the following day, the sun will also make that quincunx to Pluto. And Pluto is about the evolutionary, deep, intense, powerful transformations that occur only once. Leaves falling off trees are not plutonic. They do it every year. A caterpillar becoming a butterfly is plutonic. It only happens once. The downfall of a civilization is plutonic because although the phoenix will arise, the magical bird will arise from the ashes of the runes of destruction, runes, ashes, destruction are required. Now we're about halfway through Pluto moving through Capricorn. Capricorn is the sign of governmental structure. Capricorn is the sign of stability. It's the sign of roads and bridges and buildings and banking and things that have a sense of, and laws and things that have a sense of reality. And what we're seeing in our culture is a Plutonic deconstruction and eventually, although it's not apparent yet, reconstruction of all of this stuff. By the same token, if you're a caterpillar, you have no conception of what a butterfly might be. There's no way you could conjure up the possibility of a butterfly if you've never seen one by looking at a caterpillar. And by the same token, we're at a point that's halfway through a 20-year movement of Pluto through Capricorn, where society is being deconstructed and reconstructed, and we can't see what's on the far end. I will say, and we'll talk more about this over the months ahead, that as Saturn here moved into Capricorn last fall, as Saturn catches up with Pluto and they actually join in January of 2020, which is only a year and a half away, they make this conjunction about every 33 years. And this will be the significant turning point around all of these things that have been going on. And I don't want to dig too deeply into that right now, but that is where we're heading astrologically. In the meantime, Pluto is doing its thing, but this eclipse, the show, that would be an eclipse in Leo. Leo is the summertime show. It's the what you see is what you get. It's the drama. It's the presentation. Leo is the outward manifestation. You see, the Leo relates to the sun. When the sun is shining, you can see things. When you can see things, there's perspective. There's shadows, but you're seeing the things, not the shadows. Scorpio is more the shadows. But what's happening is that this eclipse is not getting along well. It's irritating, it's annoying, it can't quite see, because quincunxes are two planets or 2 points that are almost like invisible to one another, which is why when you adjust it, you can't get it right. It's too loud, too soft, too loud, too soft. It's the Virgo seeking perfection that's elusive because it has to be critically exactly right on. And with this eclipse, that spot is impossible to find, and yet it'll become very apparent. So I think this eclipse is an important point. The actual conjunction of the sun, the actual quincunx of the sun to Pluto occurs that evening, the evening of the eclipse. And then retrograde Mars, almost in the same breath, retrograde Mars backs into, there we go, right? I'm doing this an hour at a time. I should have done it a day at a time. There it is right there. Retrograde Mars, the following day, backs into Capricorn, where it will stay until mid-September. And remember, Mars in Capricorn is a whole lot more functional than Mars in Aquarius, which is more erratic. So that's the big shift around the eclipse. We also have then, within a few days, and let's go back to this day by day. Within a few days, we have Mercury, which has retrograded all the way back to 10 degrees, actually 11.5 degrees of Leo. Mercury on the 18th turns direct, and it begins moving forward again and ending that Mercury retrograde. It'll take a few days for the air to clear around that Mercury retrograde. Remember, however, Mars is still retrograde, but things will begin to come to light again. Things that we missed. And during that Mercury retrograde period, it's doubly important to pay attention to communication, double check things. The re-words are words that come to light in any retrograde, but especially when Mercury and Mars are retrograde at the same time. The re-words: rethink, revision, reevaluate, review, reconsider,
Restore.
Restore, re-energize, reinvigorate,
Rebel.
rebel. Someone said rest, like R-E-S-T, like rest. You got The other thing that happens toward the end of the month is that we get another wave of this grand trine energy that I talked about in my mid-month update for the middle of July, not here but online, and we've been experiencing a series of grand trines, and a grand trine is when we have three planets that are in the same element usually, and they're at about the same degree. And so what happens is that as the sun moves from Leo to Virgo on August 22nd, it's a change of astrological month or month. And the month of Virgo, you see, between now and the end of August, we're in the midsummer. Leo is the middle of the season. The fixed signs are the mid-season signs. Taurus, mid-spring. Leo, midsummer. Aquarius, midwinter. What did I skip? Sagittarius. Scorpio, mid-autumn. Thank you. So, the transition here from the middle of summer to the ending of summer is because the mutable or changeable signs, Gemini changes spring into summer, Virgo changes summer into autumn, Sagittarius changes autumn into winter, and Pisces changes winter into spring. And so that energy of the sun moving into Virgo it puts our mind in a place where summer isn't over yet. In fact, it's still in full swing, but I'm beginning to feel and sense and think about what I might be doing in the autumn. This particular year, when the sun moves into Virgo on the 22nd, 23rd, by the 24th, that sun at 2 degrees of Virgo Virgo being an earth sign, is trine to Saturn at 2 degrees of Capricorn, which is trine to Uranus at 2 degrees of Taurus. And here we have this month's saving grace. There's some stability here. There's some common sense, down-to-earth, practical stability. All the other stuff doesn't go away, but there's an ability here to become self-sufficient, efficient, productive, with one caveat, and that is a grand trine in Earth. Everything's fine. I think I'll just go take a nap. You see, Earth is about taking care of the senses. And when you get this grand trine in Earth, our tendency is to not do anything. But that's where astrology becomes so useful, because it's on these last days of the sun in Leo and the first days of the sun in Virgo. This is the time to get stuff done, so that by the time we have the next run of squares, the stresses and tensions, we have some stability to build that we've built. This is about building stability into our lives. August 25th or 22nd, but the 20th, 21st, 22nd, 23rd, that whole period of time, the sun is exactly trine Uranus on the 25th, so that during this whole period of time we're active here. It's trine Saturn on the 25th, and then that brings us to the full moon on the 26th. The actual full moon itself is at 4:56 a.m. on August 26th. Again, that's Pacific time. What we have here, though, is two things of great interest. First of all, we have this grand trine still in operation. We have the moon, the full moon, coming opposite the sun. So I've just taken away the other noise. But what we can see here now is the trine between the sun, Saturn, and Uranus, and the moon at the time of the full moon opposite the sun is then halfway between Saturn and Uranus, making a sextile to Saturn and a sextile to Uranus. This pattern, whenever you have a grand trine with one planet opposite any other planet, makes what's called, because it looks like, a kite. And a kite, you see, a grand trine is locked in its own form. That's why it's easy to be lazy or self-sufficient or invulnerable. But when you have that opposition planet, that's the way out. That's the tension that makes us do something. And here it's that moon in Pisces opposite the Virgo sun, that full moon in Pisces, that brings out our dreams and brings out our sense of compassion and can actually move us into action. So this is a very important full moon because of that. But there's something else that's going on here also, and that is Mercury is again square Jupiter. Remember that retrograde, that direct, retrograde, direct? Well, we talked about Mercury squaring Jupiter back on August 10th. And now Mercury is again on August 27th squaring Jupiter right around this full moon. And in fact, it's on that same day, actually technically the day before, that Mars turns direct. So this full moon is September 1st. I don't mean that it's September 1st, it's really August 26th, but it's as if it was the next month, because the energy break is so different. Because at this full moon, we have this grounded, practical, stable energy with Mercury moving direct, squaring Jupiter, and Mars turning direct all at the same time. And our sense perceptions are very deep, and we may actually do something about it. Why? Because we also have Venus forming a square with Pluto. It's not exact until the following, later that day. But Venus square Pluto, and so there's that sense that our feelings, our emotions are not easy to express, but they're going to come up, they're going to come out, and thankfully we have the vision of that full moon in Pisces to manage it, and the stability of the grand Earth trine to ground it. Mars turns direct that day. Actually, I said it was the day before. It's the day after. Mars turns direct on the 27th, and that brings us to the end of the month. The point I want to make, though, is that this full moon on August 26th, we in our minds might as well consider this to be the following month, because the last few days of August will feel energetically very different than the rest of August, and I would lump the last few days of July, where we are right now in time, in with the rest of August. So, in summary, the thing to keep in mind here is that we're not going to make as much progress on any front as much as we would like, because of all the retrogrades. However, and this is going to sound like I'm contradicting myself, but I'm not, we can actually make more progress if we don't push into new ground. Meaning, August is about working what we already have. It's about stabilizing, grounding. It's about trying to figure out how best to make use of the progress we've already made, and how we can best catch up with ourselves, maybe tying up loose ends that somehow escaped us, the things we forgot to do last month, I meant to, or I've always wanted to do. You can fill in the blanks in your own charts and your own lives, but that's what August is about. It's not a reprieve, but it'll be frustrating as hell if you try to push. And yet, if you use the month for what it is astrologically, to actually reevaluate, reconsider, rethink, replan, rebuild, re-energize. Then, when Mercury starts turning direct mid-month, boosted by Mars' direct by the end of the month, and then after that Pisces full moon on the 26th, it'll still take a little bit of time for everything to begin moving forward. But if you start off slowly, you'll be able to build the momentum. We will be able to build the momentum that we need. Thank you all.